Yeah, it's okay now.
Okay, so welcome everyone, whether you're in Nanjing or Washington or Bologna or scattered across the world, as many of us are at the moment. So we have for this week's HNC Friday lecture series, Dr. Lyle Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities, and previously he served for many years as research professor at the US Naval War College in Rhode Island. He's received recognition in a number of forms during a quite varied career. He's been awarded the Superior Civilian Service Medal for founding and leading the China Maritime Studies Institute. His areas of expertise include maritime security and nuclear security issues, as well as regional themes relating to the Arctic, the Korean Peninsula, China, etc. He's published widely, including 7 books on Chinese strategy, including Meeting China Halfway in 2015. He speaks both Chinese and Russian and is currently working on another book on China-Russia relations. And on a personal note, the last time I saw Lyle in person was probably about 20 years ago when we were both doing the PhD program at Princeton University. So I'm hoping that he can come and visit us in person at HNC when life gets back to normal as well. So I will turn it over to Lyle for his lecture today.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Webb. It's really a thrill to be here. I can't tell you how excited I am as a SAIS grad to return to SAIS here. It's been quite a while. Over the years, I think I've given a few lectures to SAIS audiences. I think I gave a lecture about 7 or 8 years ago on how to study the Chinese military. And then I think a few years before that, I gave a lecture on the situation in the South China Sea. So it's just wonderful to be back. And as Professor Webb suggested, I do, before the pandemic, I went to China very regularly, and I hope to do that again in the near term as soon as conditions will allow. I have never visited actually the Nanjing campus, which is something I'm a bit embarrassed about. As a very proud SAIS alum, I can say maybe my single major regret is that I did not attend the Nanjing program. But I have many colleagues who are Nanjing graduates, and they are just incredible. So I just can't say strongly enough that I'm a big believer in the kind of ethic of Nanjing, that is to bring Americans and Chinese together on a very regular basis, including in China. So that's just terrific. I applaud what you're doing, and anything I can do to help SAIS Nanjing and its graduates, please don't hesitate, okay? And you'll have all my contact information. But let's dive into what is a fascinating area. It occurred to me that it might be more appropriate to talk about, if we're going to talk about the Silk Road, we might be better off. Let's just see if I can. Okay, here we go. The news of the day, I think, is not the Polar Silk Road. It's actually China's finishing of the high-speed rail into Laos, right? And that will eventually go through Thailand to Singapore. So, wow, that's an engineering accomplishment. And I'm not sure I have anything that can compete with that today, but that it does suggest the the truly amazing. When I gave a similar lecture to this a few months ago in a Silk Road series, and I think it's just astounding to think that we're talking about China-related activities in all these domains. It just suggests how ambitious the program is. So I will share some thoughts on it. I have been working on this for quite a long time, and this is a book chapter that I'm developing in a book on Russia-China relations. I'll tell you more about that shortly. But let's get into the high north, and that means ice. And here you have a map of ice in November 2021, looking down at the pole. And the colors are a little, maybe a little odd to us. It's not white snow, but you can see the maroon is that really deep ice, multi-year ice. And what you can see immediately as we consider the northern sea route, if you can see my cursor here, the northern coast of Russia here, you can see that but the ice came on early this year and has caused a bit of a crisis for ships along the route. This area was of particular concern around Wrangel Island, the ice being particularly deep in that area. And so a number of ships were caught in the East Siberian Sea, actually, and had to be escorted by nuclear icebreaker. Vygotch is the name of the icebreaker that was sortied. And happy to report, though, that it seems to be in decent shape anyway. They just crossed through a convoy of about 8 ships just crossed through the Vilkitsky Strait right here, and they're convoying across the Kara Sea now. So it does seem to be under control, but I'll tell you, a few weeks ago, people were scratching their head going, my goodness, this looks like a really bad situation, because the ice had come on in a very severe way, that sort of blast of Arctic cold, which is, of course, not unexpected, but it definitely has stressed Russia's icebreaking capabilities. And the news yesterday actually was another heavy icebreaker. I'll talk about it. The lead Arctica class has just left St. Petersburg, where it was getting a few more repairs and is headed for the high north. So it's an interesting time, and Russia is starting to flex those new capabilities, and we're seeing just how important they can be. Now, I suppose in some ways this is a fortuitous time to discuss the Northern Sea Route, because energy prices have skyrocketed in the last couple of months. So what may have seemed to many as kind of a last dying gasp of the carbon economy, now people are saying, my goodness, this had a lot of foresight to see that LNG is important. And I'll come to this later, but here the LNG moving from Russia's Arctic and coming down into China is quite important. I remember just before the pandemic, I was in northern China. I was expecting really not to be able to breathe, because I had heard about the air in Dongbei and was very concerned. Turned out, maybe I was there during an anomaly, but I was shocked at how good the air was actually in Northeast China. Much better than expectation. And I think part of that has to be related to the decrease in use of coal and increasing use of LNG. And I just also mentioned the Suez issue, which the blockage there, I think, has given some further impetus to the Northern Sea Route that we'll talk about. But I do want to say, I spoke about my lecture on the Chinese military. I do a lot of work on Chinese military development and also on the Russian military. So, and I am trained as a defense analyst. I work for Defense Priorities. We can talk about that organization. I encourage you all to check it out. Basically, we're arguing for reform in U.S. defense policy, which we think has been a bit misguided over the last 20 years. But we're here. You can see just how much attention that Chinese defense press puts onto what Russia is doing on a day-to-day basis, but in particular on what Russia is doing in the Arctic. So this seems to be of considerable concern to Chinese strategists. So we'll get into that a bit. Although I will also talk about, of course, about economic issues, which I think are the main driver here. And I think, speaking of priorities, I think a major concern here is that we overemphasize the security aspects of the Arctic. The driving force here, I'll say, without reservation, to my estimate, is commercial. People want to make money. To get rich is glorious, as Deng said. So that explains a lot of what's going on here. There are some security aspects that I'll mention those just because that's my expertise. But there is a bit of a problem, I think, in overemphasizing those issues. In fact, it's really the commercial, and let's say very clearly the environmental aspects that should be foremost in our mind. Okay, so we'll just take this piece by piece. it's Russia in a way that's got all this started, of course. For Russia, this is not a minor interest. This is, as we China experts like to say, it's a core interest, and there's no doubt about it. In fact, we should say this interest goes way back, really goes back centuries, as I've learned when I poked more into this. But it turns out that, you can see in that Izvestia article below, you see there's an illustration of Peter the Great as he started to build the Russian Navy in the late 17th century. It turns out Peter the Great's first exposure to maritime affairs was not in the South, as you might suggest, but actually came in the North. And as a young man, really a boy, he actually insisted that he be carried by sled all the way to the Russian Arctic. This was Russia's only port at the time, at Arkhangelsk. And what did he see when he visited Arkhangelsk? The Russian fleet? No, there was no Russian fleet. He saw the Dutch fleet, the Dutch whaling fleet, and some English traders there. And he was amazed as he looked out at this port and saw these ocean-going ships there. And he said, we need this. And those of you who know something about Peter the Great, Peter the First, know that he was completely obsessed with maritime affairs. So that clearly impacted his whole life. But it's important just to realize that the Russians were in the Arctic from that point, and there were even Russian, pretty substantial maritime endeavors going on, trade and so forth, even before Peter's time, in the late 17th century. But let's also mention, Russia led the way on fielding the first icebreaker ever built. And this was called Yermak. You can see an illustration of it. It was quite astounding when it was built. It was actually built, though, by the British, which I think, is also important to emphasize, that Russia from its very earliest days was leaning on foreign assistance to help develop the Arctic. And, we can go all the way back to Vitus Bering, who charted the seas, the whole journey in his trips all the way around through the Bering Strait and so forth. He was Danish, but in the employ of the Russian Empire. But Yermak did extraordinary things. And as you can see, most ships don't serve for 70 or so years, but Yermak proved so useful, including to the Soviet Union, that they kept it working until 1964, which is really extraordinary and shows you just how important icebreakers are in that along that northern coast of Russia. Now this, just to go into Russian thinking a little more, here you have a map actually on the top left of your screen that shows German U-boat activity in the Arctic during World War II. So this is a bit of a reminder, just that Russia does feel that this is important coastline from a national security perspective, no doubt about it. But here you also see in this book on the Northern Sea Route that was published a couple of years ago, that Russian strategists extremely perturbed by the precipitous decline in trade along the Northern Sea Route as the Soviet Union collapsed. And so that should help to illustrate how important it is for today's Russian leaders, first and foremost Putin, to redevelop this, what they view as a critical asset for Russia. And now here is I think quite an important document. This is a presidential order, if you will, quite recent. And just to summarize a few points here in the different colors there, but as you can see, a dramatic increase in tonnage across the Northern Sea Route. Now, different, shipping analysts will dispute this because they will argue, well, the Russians like to massage the data in various ways, and we could talk about that. But highlighting the increase in modernized military equipment, this is something Putin feels very strongly about. That's pretty obvious. And then, but also noting the warming trends and what that means. And also I would say, having studied this document, that the Russians are quite aware that there are major environmental risks that accompany this enterprise. Okay, and just to spell this out in a little more color, here's the Arctica, which I said has just left St. Petersburg and is headed north. It's already been to the North Pole, actually, last year before it went in for repairs. But this is the lead of a class of icebreakers. They're nuclear icebreakers. Russia's the only country with nuclear icebreakers, but this is the largest and most powerful icebreaker in the world right now. And they're building 5 of them, and actually 4 of them are nearly complete. So just one more to complete the fleet. I think another will be in service, I believe, next year. So it's quite a impressive achievement from an engineering and shipbuilding point of view to carry through that program. And undoubtedly, this is one of Putin's highest priorities. And one thing I like to remind people is, well, let's first of all say these are civilian ships, really of a commercial nature. They're not, they don't have any weapons, and it's just I think important to note, each one of these Arctica class icebreakers costs about $1 billion, and of course in the U.S. that's not so much money, but in Russia that's huge money. Really, I want to emphasize that. And so the fact that Russia is putting so much capital and investment at the Northern Sea Route should tell us something about their overall strategy and goals. Now, in the right bottom corner, you see the Leader class and an article up here from the Barents Observer. Anybody interested in this issue should absolutely read the Barents Observer. They're really, in English, that's probably the best thing you'll get on it. But this Leader class is even considerably larger than the Arctica class. And the goal here, I think they'll begin building Leader class in Vladivostok, actually, which is something interesting. But the goal is to have year-round shipping along the Northern Sea Route. And just want to show you also, there is some movement to, a lot of accusations of blowing around in America, in DC, I think, suggesting that Russia is militarizing the Arctic. And here's a new Russian Arctic base. There's really a couple of these now. I'm a little skeptical, though, of this discourse. I think we're probably, I would just submit generally, there's quite a bit of hype around these things. This facility, for example, only holds about 300 soldiers. So, if you think 300 soldiers are going to march across the pole and attack Canada, I don't see that happening. But moreover, this kind of base is really just important, I think, from a search and rescue point of view and logistics point of view, if you want to make the Northern Sea Route viable. And note that they're setting up sort of Coast Guard stations along the route as well. So to me, we don't want to exaggerate this, but there is a certain amount of new military activity going on. So, by all means, we should discuss. And we will I spend a lot of time working on undersea warfare. So I am quite interested in this part of this dimension of Arctic security and happy to talk about it. There was a recent exercise, spring 2021, where you had 3 Russian submarines, nuclear submarines showing up simultaneously near Franz Josef Land. So that's, I would say this is kind of a new pattern here. We haven't seen this much Russian submarine activity up north. And you see the Chinese were paying quite a bit of attention to this exercise too. So that's something to watch. All right, well, let's talk about China's approach here, move on from Russia, and then we'll look at them, how they are joining up. So you did see this major statement in 2018, a white paper. I remember I was quite taken aback. I myself at that time was sort of, I knew, China was very interested in the Arctic. I knew they're doing a lot of research and had an icebreaker that was active and so forth. But it was not clear to me that they had thought that carefully about this. But this white paper, I think I urge you to read it. It was quite remarkable. And really, I think in retrospect, we could see that they had kind of laid the groundwork for this. And a lot of it did involve, I think, talking with Russia about a polar Silk Road and something that would benefit Russia-China relations and be an important part of that. Here you see some evidence that about just how carefully China has been thinking this through. There's a Chinese analysis, reasonably detailed, looking at all of the Russian Arctic ports and discussing which ones are most promising for Chinese investment. And it really is a comparative analysis. They even do a quantitative evaluation of each of the ports. We won't be surprised that Sabetta near the Gulf of Aab right here is the winner. Of course, that's where the big Yamal LNG plant has been set up and is now producing billions of dollars worth of gas that's going to China and elsewhere. So Sabetta maybe will be the crown jewel for the time being, and another huge gas field and oil field are being set up just in that area. In fact, as I understood it, Putin and Xi are hoping to ink the deal on that second massive LNG plant, I think, in the next month or two. So that's underway. But even some surprises here, actually. For example, reasonably high on the Chinese rankings is a city I had never heard of, which is not saying that much, but this city, Uelin, which is actually very close to Bering Strait. So it will be interesting to watch if the Chinese are planning to, develop a presence in that area so close to Alaska. Something to watch. I'm happy to talk more about that article there. But I mean, what we see is a pretty steady increase in Chinese abilities, expertise in the Arctic. That's impressive. And, there was this book by Anne-Marie Brady years ago that kind of spells a lot of this out. And we could talk about that book if you like. I don't quite see the world the way Brady does, but definitely applaud her in the expansive effort. And one thing that she really reveals very clearly is that why is China so interested and how are its capabilities? How do they evolve so quickly? It's not that they evolve so quickly. It's that China really started in this in the 80s and was devoting a lot of effort toward Antarctica. So it really honed its expertise in Antarctica first, and but now is able to bring a lot of that capability into the Arctic domain, capability and experience. There's another aspect of this I want to mention as well, and that is the Korean aspect. I actually was, right before the pandemic, I was able to visit the city of Hunchun, right there where Russia, China, and North Korea come together. And it's quite a remarkable place. I urge you to visit. But I had been told, and didn't take it very seriously, that Hunchun, this little Chinese city, is like going to be China's gateway to the Arctic at some point. There is a logic there. If you see, this as a gateway for China's northern provinces in Dongbei, then one can imagine that port could become quite interesting. And I as somebody who follows the Korean Peninsula very carefully, I must agree that port does have a lot of potential, and we might want to think that how that could influence the Korean situation. But it does have that Arctic dimension to keep in mind. All right, and one more aspect of Chinese strategy I want to raise is this issue of normative discourse here. And I've been asked a lot, how much will the situation change now that Russia has the chair of the Arctic Council? It's an interesting area, and no doubt our Secretary of State Pompeo had very strongly said, look, China is not an Arctic power. This idea of a near Arctic power, he said, is meaningless. It has no legal meaning. So let's not pretend it does. But unquestionably, as this slide shows, China is interested in this discourse power, and as a observer in the Arctic Council, it wants to be sure that its rights are protected, and I think that's reasonable. All right, let's talk about how the two are getting along in the Arctic and what are they doing together, for sure. That's the heart of our discussion here. Well, here's some evidence that we want to look at how the two see each other in the Arctic. And here's a bit of evidence from, I think, a very good source. If any of you have heard of Valdai, I don't know if you can you can see down here in the corner, this is Valdai is sort of Putin's place where he comes to dialogue and trade big ideas. But the Valdai organization had put out this kind of infomercial, call it, on what China is doing in the Arctic. And I think this is partly to reassure the Russian elite that the Kremlin is happy about what's going on. That China is making serious investments. That they're not just playing around, building up icebreakers, indeed, this synergistic relationship that's discussed up here in the corner, where yes. Why is China doing this? Part of the explanation is that it is looking for that dynamic economic growth in China's northeast, and the same is true with Russia, right? Siberia and the Russian Far East are rather underdeveloped, and so both sides are looking for that this issue to help develop these undeveloped areas. Here's an interesting map that shows a kind of Chinese analysis of some of the resource potential, and no surprises, oil and gas figuring at the top of this list. You can see the green dots are gas fields, and the oil is in yellow. But really huge potential here, and we can see that. Well, with all the activity over the last 15 years, you would think that this was all in place, but actually there's a lot more work to do. And as you know, China is a very thirsty dragon in this respect. And a lot of it does have to do with ameliorating the move away from coal, which, China's, in Nanjing, you can fully appreciate that, but China's been rather addicted to coal, like many countries. And to move away from that, these other sources of energy are important. Now, I do want to say there's quite a bit of skepticism about this, particularly in Western circles. And here you get a taste of that. An article that came out a few years ago. It's a good article, by the way. I learned a lot from reading it. But, this idea of this marriage of convenience, these are the underlying idea being these are two countries that really don't like each other. They don't really want to cooperate. And they can't really cooperate, and it's kind of skin deep type, symbolic type cooperation. Here you see this quote saying, as Arctic partners go, China is probably one of the last that Russia would choose if given a choice. I don't really see it that way. I think that's overly pessimistic, and we kind of want to psychoanalyze people, but we could talk about why Westerners seem to have this kind of predisposition to be incredibly skeptical about Russia-China cooperation. From what I can see, though, it's for real. It's broad. It's deep. It's and it's moving on a lot of fronts. So we can I have a book underway on the issue, and that'll be what I'll be arguing in that book. And happy to certainly contend with other points of view. There is a robust debate on the issue, but now. Look, if you can find a lot of Russian skepticism out there, here's, this just gives you a hint of it. This title of the article kind of hints that Russia is being used by China, something like that. Although I remember reading the article, that's not really where the article goes. That this seems to be what an editor just slapped on. The article is more about, substantive cooperation, actually. I think this probably is a more accurate view among Russian specialists of the Arctic here. You can see this by Svetlana Borisova. It's pretty, this is just from August. But if you read these quotes, you'll see she's saying, look, there's absolutely no way they could have pulled off this Yamal field, which again is sort of seen is one of sort of the jewels in the Russian economy right now, really cashing in big for Russia, especially right now. And, they could not have done this without Chinese expertise and engineering prowess. So there it is. You see at the quote at the bottom, kind of, a real sense that Russia was abandoned by the various Western countries, and that the United States in particular has taken a really hostile view toward Russia-China cooperation, and including in the Arctic, deploying a kind of wedge strategy. I'll come back to that when I conclude. Now, here's a Chinese analysis that discusses this is quite current, again, 2021, kind of strengths and weaknesses. And I didn't translate everything here, but, we can just go through, a strength, increasing capabilities, sure. And here, an opportunity, the Yamal, again, is taken as really the best evidence that China and Russia can work together on big long-term projects. This is an interesting statement that China doesn't have allies in the Arctic. Is that you could take that in one of a couple of ways. That Russia does not really act like an ally. We'll talk about that, or maybe that it needs that upgrade to be an ally, so that China can get what it really needs in the Arctic. And then this concern about growing foreign interference in the growth of the Polar Silk Road. So this is viewed as a threat. So, you can see more of the Chinese perspective, and this is from that same article. I think it's quite illustrative, this graphic. I mean, in some ways it's stating what's obvious, but this Chinese analyst put side by side, different capabilities of different countries here, Russia being in black, the US in the gray, and China. So you can see, sorry, this isn't quite black, but state the obvious. This has occurred to everybody, but on icebreakers, there's just simply no contest. I mean, nuclear conventional icebreakers, whatever you have, and Russia is even increasing its lead vastly, I would say. So, no contest there. This is nuclear submarines. Sorry, I didn't translate all these nuclear submarines, scientific stations, and here's military bases. So, you look at this graphic, and I think the message is clear. Russia is the right partner for China. And you can see more evidence of the priority here. Again, this is from 2020. 重中之重, it's so important, right? The top priority for future cooperation between China and Russia. Wow, that's quite a statement. There's I happen to know this author, Sun Kai, very capable analyst of Arctic affairs. But I think he's making a good point here, which is, we've kind of had a radical turn, and whether, it was Trump's idea that the US would buy Greenland, or Pompeo's famous speech, and I think it was in 2018 before the Arctic Council, where he really kind of ripped into Russian and Chinese policies in the Arctic. Sun Kai is saying we're kind of in a different environment after that, where Arctic affairs are being securitized. I think he's got a point. Just another view of how important China's role here is. And the first Chinese ships crossing the Northern Sea Route were back in 2013, but they're coming across pretty regularly. I don't think any are in that convoy right now. Here's another example, though, of large-scale Russia-China cooperation in the Arctic. This is a multi-million-dollar project to build these floating nuclear plants. This is one. This is just written up in the New York Times in great detail, although they didn't mention the Chinese contribution. But a lot of this was the hull, in particular, I think, fabricated in China. Well, this is sitting outside the Russian Arctic city of Pevek right now, providing power, which is very important. But if you latest reports, if you go on Barents Observer, you'll see that they are now going to build 4 or 5 more of these, and this will be the backbone of a major copper mining operation in Chukotka. So this is a new way of deploying nuclear power, but certainly one that has the potential to transform the Arctic. And the fact that China and Russia are working together on this is really, I think, interesting. With some audiences, I would call this my most important slide here, because this is, I think, a very candid view from Chinese strategists saying, look, as China gets into the Arctic, it really is Russia as the key link. But also this quote here, I think, discussing how the Arctic has, is an area where Russia and China can cooperate and not be sort of, as it were, limited by U.S. activities or U.S. counter efforts. that's kind of an interesting approach. We can talk more about this, but I think it's quite an important article. I did want to just say something about my larger book project to put this all in context. I've got my lit review. You can see I did give a talk at Harvard about a year ago where I kind of laid out the whole plan for the book and talked about some other case studies, although I do think the Arctic case study is one of the most interesting. But as you can see, I'll be working on all these different areas. Here are my case studies. And I wasn't going to have a Latin America chapter, but now I was convinced by some reviewers that I really need to have one. So I'll be working on that as well. I just completed the Africa chapter, which was fascinating. But there are some really fine books, though, on the issue already, I should say, and particularly recommend these three by I would call them partners in constructivism, Marcinski here and Rosman, and here's Larson and Shevchenko. This one in particular is quite new from Yale. Highly recommended. We can talk more about it, but I think it's one of the most fantastic reviews of how to think about Russia and China. But I do want to say, my general take on this, though, is we can imagine different futures for Russia-China relations, a low, medium, high. It seems to me pretty clear we're now in the medium phase. But do we move to high? Do, President Xi and Putin, do they throw the Russia-China relationship into high gear? What would that mean? I don't think they've done so yet. And, I think there are real reasons that they're not doing it, because they know that this really would be affirming a new Cold War, I think is the problem. But you could see, for example, a much higher level of military industrial cooperation, for example. Imagine Russia building aircraft carriers in China. That it could be that level. The book looks at all different aspects, and including economic aspects of the relationship, but we'll be strong on the security front. Okay, I'll wind up here a couple more minutes on what my bottom line is. What do I recommend, especially for American leaders? Again, I've talked a lot about security, but I do think the commercial and really the environmental issue is probably the one we should focus on. If I had the appropriate expertise, I probably would say, put all this aside and let's focus on the environment. We're all concerned with global warming. And the global warming argument on the Northern Sea Route is important. I do think there are two sides to this, right? Some of the big shipping routes, shipping companies have already said, look, this is environmentally dangerous and we don't want to go there. I'm sure that comes after a very complete analysis. And most of it has to do with the fact that the risks of, say, like a spill. And there have already been some spillage of toxic materials in the north. So, going back to the Soviet period and so forth. So, not wanting to minimize that, though, I do think it's worth saying, though, that, the route across the north is much shorter. So, that implies lower carbon emissions. And of course, the escort fleet is mostly nuclear icebreakers. So, again, potentially there you have a lower carbon footprint. So that's important to keep in mind. But I would emphasize also this experience of, I had where you felt very acutely that LNG is significantly cleaner than coal. And so to the extent that a lot of LNG is moving across the Arctic and from the Arctic, that's important. I do think I haven't addressed the fisheries issue, but that is an important one. I know I just saw an article last week how Russia is building up its Arctic fishing fleets. That's a bit concerning. And to the extent, how much will China get into that? It's a good question. China is very involved in like the krill fishery here, you can see in the Antarctic. And some questions have arisen about their behavior there. Although my own review of that issue, I did not, it seemed to me that China was playing by the rules of pretty much just what we'd want them to do. Although they have definitely taken a high market share of the krill fishery, but it's one to watch certainly as we go forward in the Arctic. And the Arctic fisheries are almost, some of the last fisheries on Earth that have not been, fished out. And so we want to be extremely careful about this, unquestionably. Now, on the military side, there is an increase in Chinese interest in cold weather operations. Now, look, China has always had an interest in this, partly because of its lessons learned from the Korean War. So it's not to say that this definitely has an Arctic angle, but I think China, as this drill that's summarized here shows, that China is really increasing its expertise. By the way, part of this is directed also at its operations in the mountains in the Himalayas too. So, China has a lot of interest in cold weather warfare. And China's not the only country, of course, but they are increasing their capabilities there. By the way, I should mention they've also built at least 2 military icebreakers in recent years. So that's also a new development. Now, here's a sensitive area where I used to work at Naval War College. People spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, but I did want to bring this up too. This is basically Chinese research showing how the heck do you get those submarines to go through the ice like that? And this is pretty, as you can see, is pretty detailed research. And the engineering is let's say, difficult to move submarines through the ice in a safe way. And I would say there's enough of this material to say that I think China does have an ambition to have submarines in the Arctic. And indeed, I do expect probably in the next decade to see a Chinese submarine, say, surface at the North Pole. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were Russian submariners aboard that Chinese submarine. So it's something I expect. I think we should not freak out about it. It's kind of like landing somebody on the moon, but taking a submarine to the North Pole is something we did in 1959. So, China has it. The evidence. Oh, there's my timer telling me to wind up. I think the evidence is really incontestable that China has an ambition to have submarines in the Arctic. Now, this takes it to a whole nother level, though, I would say. It's one thing to have a submarine occasionally visit the Arctic, especially for PR purposes, as I was just suggesting. But here you have a Russian strategist sort of laying out a much darker scenario where he's saying, look, it's not easy for Chinese submarines to strike the American homeland. So if they were to be based, if they could operate with support from Russian Arctic ports, then in that case, they would have a much easier shot at American cities, with various kinds of, whether nuclear arms or conventional arms. This is pretty disturbing. And when I saw this from a Russian author who's pretty well-regarded strategist, I was taking this quite seriously. Now, look, this is not, I read Nezavismaya Gazeta all the time, and I can tell you that it's not, the Kremlin talking points or something like that, not at all. So, we don't want to over hype this, but it's something to watch. And the fact that this has entered Russian strategic discourse at all is quite remarkable. I haven't seen a lot more on it, and I haven't seen any kind of Chinese discussions of this possibility, but it's something to watch. But it's also, I think, a concern, that is to say, it's something that we don't want to see. That's what a militarized Arctic looks like. And I think we need to strive to prevent that. Now, let me paint that out just a little bit more here. Anybody really interested in the Arctic here on this discussion will want to take a look at the latest issue of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, which is put out by, I think by not Naval War College, but the Air War College in Alabama. They have done a special issue on the Arctic. So this is something I want to take seriously. But among the articles there, you'll see one by Burke and Matsek there. This just came out. That's why I'm raising it. But it's a really, I would say, again, in a way, it just mirrors that article I just showed you in Russian, but a kind of very dark view of the future of the Arctic. They say we don't just need to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. We need to pivot to the Arctic. We need to counter Russian and Chinese malign activities. They're critical of Arctic apologists. who have a utopian view. They think China has an unquenchable resource consumption, and they are concerned about Russian challenge to the law of the sea. And what they want to do is recommend we draw red lines, increase our polar warfare capabilities, and dedicate resources to the intelligence community, as well as give quote clear guidance to commands. That one I find a little unnerving. I'm quite critical of this viewpoint. I think it's sort of worst casing and takes us maybe in the wrong direction. To me, probably, well, my view is that this is probably more fuel on the fire of heating up an Arctic arms race is something we don't want to see. So we have to, I would be cautious about this. Now, in the corner here, you see a new Department of the Navy strategy too, which I hate to say it, but it sounds a little bit like the article by Burke Matisek. That is, it's kind of a bit of worst casing, I think. And now you can dismiss this all as, military bureaucracy or bureaucrats seeking, new missions and new funds and so forth. There's some of that is in play, I do think, but I'm also just generally concerned about the tone of discourse of American strategists are convinced that the Arctic is a new place for superpower competition across the board. And this gives you a sense of just the Russians are really very unnerved by new moves by NATO into the Arctic. It just gives you a sense of the what you see. This is really comes across daily in the Russian press. So this is not positive, I don't think. And well, I thought I would just give also a end on a people's perspective, as it were. This is the Nome Nugget, which I can't say I read regularly, but I wish I did. Nome is one of these a not very big city in Alaska, but about as far from Washington D.C. as you can get. But they have their kind of own local view on this. And here you can see one of their papers discussing the movement of a Russian tanker moving through the Bering Strait. And actually, if we want to talk about threats to the United States, one of the biggest threats is that if that tanker, if something bad happened and we could have an enormous oil spill right in the Bering Strait. So that's, in my view, that probably is the biggest threat of the Northern Sea Route to the United States. We might want to keep that in mind. And Alaska itself is already benefiting from all this kind of Arctic hype. In my view, they're getting quite a bit of money, seeing a lot more military activity. You can see here, even India is coming to town to exercise in the high north. So as the U.S. builds its alliance network here in the Indo-Pacific. But I would also, if I sat down with some folks from Nome, I'd say, hey, look, you might want to look at this also. Another perspective is, could Alaska benefit from the Northern Sea Route, right? Why shouldn't Alaska ship goods, resources off to Norway and Rotterdam and all over Europe via the Northern Sea Route? And why shouldn't it share some of its expertise in the polar domains with the Russian Arctic, which is probably underdeveloped by comparison? So this is an area for dialogue here, but I think there's a different approach. And really my approach that I'm advocating is that the United States, instead of treating the Arctic Northern Sea Route that Russia and China are working on as anathema and a national security threat and a violation of international law and so forth, I think we might take a different perspective, more enlightened perspective, and think about how the Northern Sea Route is coming, whether we like it or not. I don't think we can stop it, but by participating in it, you can have a role in how it develops. You can help ensure that it is not a environmental devastation. You can ensure that it is not highly militarized. I mean, what better way to prevent the appearance of Chinese submarine bases in the Arctic than by having American businessmen in those bases with knowing, that this really is a commercial enterprise. So that's kind of my approach: engage, and in that way, we know it will be better, more sensitive to our concerns, including environmental concerns. So this is this point number 2, I think is quite important. But it's a little bit subtle, but let me see. I don't want to talk your ears off here, but I think we need to think about the Polar Silk Road as a bridge, and one that can develop what I call, or social science, we call cross-cutting cleavages. The main cleavage, right, is east-west, right? Russia, China on one side, as the cover of the Atlantic just said, you know, the bad guys. I think that was the sophisticated terminology. And I mean, to me, this is kind of crazy talk. We need to break that down, and that's not positive for the future of world politics. A better approach are these bridges. What kind of bridge am I talking about? Well, here you see Moon Jae-in. Where is he? He's in Moscow addressing the Duma. Wow, that's pretty extraordinary. A South Korean leader going to Moscow to talk to the Russian parliament. He did this in 2018. That's the kind of bridges that we need. And South Korea, turns out, has a big interest in this shipping across the Northern Sea Route. So I would like to see, like, South Korea and Japan, you know, very involved with this. And I think ultimately that would help their relations with China, actually, but by developing better relations with Russia. And South Korea has kind of led the way there. But think about this a different way. Another bridge, cross-cutting cleavages. The Scandinavian countries are very interested in China, although their relationship has kind of gone up and down in a lot of ways. But why shouldn't, you know, Finland or Sweden lead the way, you know, with China and make Arctic cooperation a centerpiece? And that, in a weird sort of backdoor way, could help Sweden and Finland's relationship with Russia, which has been very tense, and Norway as well. So, you know, that's what I'm talking about in terms of these cross-cutting cleavages that are very important. Okay, well, I've talked about the environment. I think it's, you know, this clearly is a way for us to engage, you know, across the board, fisheries, mining, you name it. We need to be in there working closely and helping to make sure that we don't create an environmental disaster. And, you know, Russia does not have a good record on environmental management. I mean, that's pretty darn clear. Okay, and by the way, I haven't mentioned indigenous peoples here, but this is a huge concern, and we should all take an interest in that. And they are out there. I was just reading about a letter sent to the UN by the people of Chukotka, and they're extremely concerned about all these this new Arctic development, which is going to change their lives no matter what. And so, you know, who's going to stand up for them? And I think by engaging, we can help to increase their discourse power. Driving wedges, to me, we're just increasing the paranoia and the militarization the more we try to drive wedges. So I'm not a big fan of that. We can discuss more. I know a lot of American strategists these days are obsessed with this. You know, what is the best wedge? You know, how are we going to bang that wedge in? You know, I'm pessimistic there. Partly because the Chinese and Russians they've been there before. They know what the wedge looks like, and they're very determined to keep this relationship on course. And I will, you know, as a military strategist, I can say, look, you know, we can't rule out the worst case entirely. And, you know, I realize that, you know, that there may be a future in which we have to be more concerned about these straits. But if you look at maps, I don't see a major deployments of Chinese submarines into the Arctic as a regular pattern. And I don't think we need to be excessively worried about that. So let's focus on the commercial and environmental aspects. I guess that's the line I'll finish with. But thanks very much for your attention, and stand by for any questions. And thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks so much. So I guess we can open up questions that people have. Since it's a relatively small group, we can just have people put their hands up or speak, I guess. Haley.
Yeah, my question is, often when you have when you talk about the ecological consequences of development that like China is pursuing, a common response is that's just a Western, you know, problem. Like that's the first thing Westerners always bring up is the environment, but China has a right to development. How do you like respond to like these types of things?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you're right. There is a kind of how to put it. The environment becomes a kind of cudgel that the West intends to use on various development projects that the Chinese have underway. There are so many examples of this. I don't think I need to provide any more, but it's. I agree that you have to be very careful about that, and I think that there's a way to handle that. I think that is both conscious of what's at stake here, but also realizes that other countries do have a right to development. I mean, to me, it's extraordinarily insensitive to. It's not just China, but Russia also. I mean, there's no question that the Russian Arctic and the Russian Far East are, comparatively underdeveloped. So to tell them that, no, you got to just, you can't possibly use these resources. There can't be any infrastructure, that's, I think it's not a viable path forward. So that's why I'm advocating for this kind of middle path, which says, look, there will be developed, maybe they should be developed. Look, Russians and Chinese want to have the same standard of living that we Americans enjoy, or that's enjoyed across much of the developed world. So it's going to happen. So now, but can we do this in a responsible way? And can we do it in a non-antagonistic way, in a more cooperative way? I think we can, but it is hard. The environment is a tough issue. Look, lately I've just taken a great interest in Alaskan affairs, and the amount of controversy in Alaska about how to develop it, where to develop it, what's environmentally, what we can tolerate, how the indigenous people are treated, they're incredibly complex issues. But I still think we have to go forward and go forward with a sensitivity. It's often said the Arctic, I think more than other domains, could be truly devastated. It just doesn't have the regeneration ability. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of the world's last remaining coral reefs are under the Arctic, actually. They've recently found them, and they think that there's a lot more. So I was just thinking about wow, I can't imagine what an oil spill would do to these very sensitive, slow growing, because typically things in the cold grow much slower. Right. So anyway, it was just a thought.
Yeah. And I think this is another reason also to hope that the issue is not over militarized, because I could tell you, I live in Rhode Island, which is a wonderful place, and Narragansett Bay here. But I could tell you, the armed forces are not very good at environmental stewardship. I think they would admit that themselves. And the more militarized this occurs, that is people who are not used to thinking about the environment very much, and a lot of it is done in secret and so forth. That to me is kind of just opening the door to more environmental devastation. So we want to keep this keep the level of militarization low, and that has been generally the norm. Although we don't want to sugarcoat this. I mean, during the Cold War, there were all kinds of military activities in the Arctic, but we don't want to go back to that period, I don't think.
Okay, Zach.
Thanks, Dr. Goldstein, Dr. Webb. I have two questions I'm going to shoot at you. The first is if you have any updates, anything that you've seen fairly recently about maybe some disagreements among China and Russia regarding infrastructure projects up north. There's usually a lot of very big, lofty goals, but sometimes they don't exactly pan out for financial regions, geostrategic regions. I'm thinking very specifically of the Baltimore Railway, which on paper, but turns out some people didn't want it, some people didn't want to pay for it, yada yada yada. So I'm wondering if you've seen anything popping up like that recently. I think there's also supposed to be a port in Archangelisk or something like that never really came to fruition. And my second question would be that both Xi and Putin are about to enter their 70s, and I'm wondering how you see their partnership should there be, or when there is a change in leadership in one and in both of them, how their relationship regarding the Arctic will change whenever there's new people in the seats of power?
Yeah, interesting questions. As far as new development, I mean, like I said, I guess the latest murmurs I'm hearing are just again right out of Barrett's Observer. Was reviewing this morning, talking about the this new the second part of the Arctic, basically an add-on to the Yamal LNG. But I mean, you know, you might think yeah. When you might think it's a footnote, but it actually, you know, we're talking about, you know, ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars potentially. So, I mean, it's actually, even though it's a small, you know, when you look at that corner of the world, you're kind of like, okay, we know about that, but this actually keeping it going and keep adding that next level may consume a lot of money and energy, even in the short term. In fact, I was noting that one of China, I was reading the reports on where the Russian icebreakers were operating over the last week, and they kept one of their newest icebreakers, even despite this kind of crisis. They kept one of the newer icebreakers right in the Gulf of Ab, and you can imagine why, right? I mean, they're doing all this work there, right? So they need that. The port needs to be kept operating, you know, with the close attention of one of their best icebreakers. So. There was an article, I could send it to Zach, since I know you're interested in this area, but it was in Nezavisma Gazeta just last week. It was interesting. It basically said, the title was something like, Russia is cautious about Chinese investment. That was the title. And the article, again, you wonder if the editor really read the article carefully, because the article talks about a lot of different investment projects, but I mean, that kind of title, I mean, the implication is that Russia has, you know, they want the investment, they want to talk projects, but they are a little leery of too much Chinese control. So you see that now and then. I think as I look at, I haven't focused too much lately on the railway issue. But, you know, I remember I was in Vladivostok. They were talking about China wants to build high-speed rail right into Vladivostok. And seemingly that should be pretty easy project, right? A lot easier than building into Laos. And yet, what is it that's dragging the project, keeping it back? And I have to think that it's maybe Russian bureaucrats saying, maybe we want to do this.
Is it some sort of a fear, maybe over like some like economic suzerainty or something?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, we know all these incredible projects. In Laos, you don't have a group of bureaucrats saying, hey, you know, why can't Laos just build this high-speed rail? Why do we really need those Chinese? In Russia, you have that kind of sensibility of like, hey, we Russians build fantastic trains. We built the Transsib. We can do this. Why do we really need all these Chinese here telling us what to do? So there is that kind of like this sort of, hey, how about us? You know, why are, and this, they don't want to cede control. So even though the Chinese clearly have a lot of the skills and prowess and the money. So Russia, you know, there's a lot of talk in Russia, you know, we don't want to be a colony or something like this kind of, you hear that quite a bit. There are some rather sensitive issues. Just to give you a couple examples, like, well, we didn't talk about this. This is not so much in the Arctic, but just south of the Arctic, literally, if you look at the Arctic Circle, just south of there, you'll see there's a lot of big forests in Siberia that are being cut down for what? For the Chinese economy. And clear cutting is a huge problem now in Siberia, and getting those Chinese timber companies to play by the rules, and also the Russians who, you know, some Russians have been corrupted by that practice. So there are some hard points here, and that's normal though. I think you know, look at U.S.-Mexican relations, similar kind of dynamics. You know, we're you know, just to give another example, there was a coal disaster in Russia that just happened in near Novosibirsk. I think 50 coal miners were killed. Well, look at the incentive calculus if you own a mine in Siberia right now. You know, the price of coal is way up. There are blackouts in China. You're going to produce as much coal as you possibly can. You're going to run like 24-hour operations, right? And you're going to ignore some safety protocols, and people get killed. So I mean, in effect, you could almost blame Chinese demand for this Russian tragedy. Now that's going way too far, but I'm just saying, you know, a lot of Russians are being, their lives are being impacted, right, by this Russia-China trade, and you know, for good and for ill, and it's complicated. So the Russians have some reservations, and but you know, the market, I think, is by and large dictating how this is developing, and the relationship continues to develop. I think they will. The forecast I looked at yesterday says, from Prime Minister Mishustin, says they will cross 200 billion. And if without the pandemic, they would have crossed it a long time ago. So it's, you know, I see a lot of running room in that Russia-China economic relationship. It should eventually start to look quite a bit like the Canada-US relationship, which is, you know, a very robust economic relationship.
Okay, next question from anyone?
Yes,
Yeah,
if
sure,
you would mind commenting though on my question about
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
leaderships.
Your first question was so intriguing. I neglected the second one also. That's a tough one, Zach. You know, I mean, let me stay up front. I don't think either leader, as I understand them, and I'm not an expert really on leadership politics, but I don't think either one was necessarily very predisposed to be oriented in support of the Russia-China relations. I think they came there by, you know, a set of circumstances. And I think I've seen Putin in particular, who I think was not necessarily, you know, who even maybe could have been a little skeptical of the China relationship early on, has sort of become more and more enthusiastic. And if you hear him speaking lately, I mean, I think it was at Valdai. I heard one interview with him. I was even a bit shocked by how much praise he was ready to heap onto China. Excuse me. But she, you know, again, some leaders do seem to have a kind of, you know, maybe they studied Russian in the past or something, that have a kind of orient toward Moscow. I don't think she was ever one of those. You know, he studied in the States and stuff like that, or he spent time in the States. But, you know, you've seen them generally come around to this. So I really think it's interests that are driving this, and more a common worldview. And as they discovered, even a common experience, you know, having grappled with socialism and all its challenges. So, you know, I guess my going in thought on this, maybe want to think about this more, but is that the future leaders will probably see it quite similarly. I see a record of rather stable development. Just say quickly, we haven't talked about history, but I did my dissertation on this, but I'll just throw in quickly that I think both sides, when they reflect on the Sino-Soviet conflict, right, that's from way ancient history, but it rears its head now and then, this history. In fact, I just saw a Russian article that called it the Forgotten War. You know, for Americans, we consider the Korean War the Forgotten War, but the Russians were calling the Zhenbaodao, the Damansky Island set of skirmishes, as the Forgotten War. But there is some reflection, and I think on both sides, a sense that, boy, why did this happen? What was behind this? And a kind of sense of like, we cannot let this happen again. You know, we cannot let ideology drive us apart. And so we just have to go with our interests, and our interests are closely aligned. So, you know, the stakes, I think they understand the stakes are huge. So, you know, they're quite determined to keep this on a path, and that it's been remarkably stable. I can't think of a single crisis. Maybe when some poison water went into one of the rivers, that was maybe a little bit of a crisis. But other than that, what's the last crisis in Russia-China relations that you can think of? So it's quite a stable trajectory.
Thank you.
I have a question. This is obviously rather out of my area of expertise, but what is the composition of trade of shipping that happens across this area in terms of what sector and what countries are, for example, shipping to and from China? And I ask this because from a security standpoint, I'm not sure I see in a kind of global crisis scenario what the value of controlling the Arctic would be, because a lot of the trade between Russia and China goes over land, and the areas that would be at the other end of this route from a Chinese perspective, such as in Europe or Eastern North America, are areas that would cut off trade in a crisis anyway. So what exactly flows across there that would be important to secure in a time of tensions?
A great question. And having worked for the Navy for a long time, I could say that people do think about these things. And, my impression, having thought a lot about Chinese strategy for the last 2 decades, I would say that they are very concerned with, Malaya Kunju, the Malacca Strait dilemma, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's, can China find a way to get what it needs in a crisis, like a Taiwan crisis? And so you have that, a follow-on question: does the Arctic somehow serve, to support China's resource needs in a crisis? I mean, I'm one who believes that I don't think China can be blockaded effectively. It's just too ambitious. And China has all these overland corridors, particularly with Russia now, and Russia is a kind of storehouse of resources, not just energy, but Russian agriculture, for example, has been coming on very strong over the last several years. So I think it's the biggest grain exporter in the world now. So the idea that Russia becomes kind of this key link. Now, as far as shipping, well, could you conceivably ship sensitive goods across the Arctic corridor to counter such a blockade? Well, it's a little dicey. I mean, theoretically, those ships could sail in Russian waters for most of the voyage, and then even come into that port at Rajin if that was built. And would the United States, let's say in a conflict or crisis, would the United States be willing to interdict Chinese vessels that were sailing inside Russian waters? I don't think so. So you have something there. But I mean, as far as like sensitive passages, right? Again, the Bering Strait. Let's put it this way: if the United States wanted to close those passages, from a military point of view, it could do so. But of course, the Russians, might risk conflict with Russia. Look, to get back to where you started the question, what is the shipping composition along the line? It's pretty small right now. It's well under 1% of what we see going through Suez. But the ambition that the Russians have, and I think the Chinese and a few others, are interested in, is what if that changes remarkably? Like, what if the warming continues at the rate that we're seeing, then we'll see less and less ice. And the Russians, like I said, this massive fleet of icebreakers are intended to just ensure that the path stays open. And by the way, they're not just talking about staying open, for 7 or 8 months a year. They're talking about year-round shipping on this. And they've already brought across, some sensitive cargo, including LNG, during the wintertime, that is during like January, February, which is a remarkable feat of engineering that was first done a couple of years ago. Will they get to that level? I don't have a definitive answer. I'm not a shipping expert, but my sense is, let's put it this way: with these high prices now, you begin to see a future where this looks really promising and viable, and you can see why the Russians are making all this investment. Now, if prices drop, a year from now, and we're back in that, where a lot of these resources issues don't make sense, then I think there are a lot of questions arise. But in this environment that we're in now, anyway, it sure looks very wise. I think from a commercial point of view. From a strategic point of view, though, I think you're right, Adam, that it's hard to make a case that this is the kind of crucial sea lane. But the Chinese Navy, I want to say, is taking an interest in this whole set of developments and considering what they're doing. I remember last time I was in China, I was even asked, what is the strategic importance of the Sea of Japan? And if you look at a map, you'll see the Sea of Japan is a little bit distant from China. It's not, China doesn't have any ports on the Sea of Japan, except maybe that North Korean port. So, I think they do have their eye on this and they're thinking about the possibilities, but they're not obvious. That is to say, the possibilities from a strategic point of view.
Other questions?
Hello, Dr. Goldstein. Great to speak with you today. In your book, Meeting China Halfway, I'm really captivated by the idea of cooperation spirals that you bring up. In this issue, if there were political will in Washington to become more involved in the Arctic, what are some entry points that you see? You mentioned Alaska, but do you intend to map out any more specific kind of policy directions? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Forrest. Thanks for kindly bringing up my book. You'd be surprised how many people ask me, are you still willing to, haven't you rethought this? Like, weren't you just wrong? Things like that. Say, well, why would you possibly ever consider, cooperation spirals with China? Well, I would argue that the book was prescient. I saw that we were headed into a new Cold War even before Trump came around, and I knew we had to take radical steps to head this off, and so that's why I came up with those spirals. But as I've seen, and well, this is something I'd love to work with Hopkins Nanjing on, because I would love to put a bunch of brilliant students at these issues. How do we build out cooperation spirals? I mean, as you can see, I had many areas, and I did talk about Latin America and Africa and all these areas where we should dialogue with China and build cooperation spirals. But I guess you noticed, Forrest, that I did not mention the Arctic in the book, and I'm a little embarrassed about that now. I remember being asked about it at the time. I was like, you didn't mention this at all. Well, yeah, if I could rewrite it, I probably would have a discussion, and the book I'm working on now, of course, will address that. But I mean, I do think that the entry point, well, I mean, commerce has a way of settling all kinds of ideological differences, right? So, I mean, I've considered, like, maybe I need to go out to Alaska or to Seattle, kind of make the argument that, geez, why doesn't the U.S. try sending some ships across, and if this, maybe it works to to build some connections here between the Northwest areas of the U.S. and say Europe, that take account of the economic benefits of this development. So I do think that could be a way to help build out some of these relationships. But the U.S. has enormous experience in energy, right? I mean, we're the leaders in a lot of this technology and so forth. We haven't always done a great job of it, but we just have that enormous experience. So why not help bring that into this? And I have to say, I do think the environmental side, and again, I don't pretend that the U.S. has made huge mistakes in the environment too. But it's learning from that experience. And I've I remember, not to get off topic here, but was it after Hurricane Katrina, I remember I did some lectures in China on the U.S. response to Hurricane Katrina. And I was more or less talking about a lot of mistakes that the U.S. made, how do we deal with these superstorms? And the Chinese were fascinated and wanted to share data and discuss, and a lot of Chinese cities are vulnerable to these superstorms too. So there's a lot of room to discuss, and a lot of areas the U.S. can learn from China, and China can learn from the U.S. So I think, to me, and working together with Russians and Japanese, South Koreans and Scandinavians, like this to me, if we think about it hard, this really can be as it were, kind of an exemplar of multipolarity as we'd like it to look. So I feel strongly that we, that there are open doors here that we can walk through. But I'm very disturbed by this new discourse here. I hate to say, I don't want to be too critical of my old employer, but I think the U.S. Navy and a lot of the Pentagon have really bought off on this, the Arctic as a possible domain for future warfare, and that's very exciting to them. And it's fresh and new. It doesn't look as ugly as Afghanistan. And I mean, the truth is, the U.S. Navy has operated with great proficiency in the Arctic for decades. We could say, I think still we're the best at it. And we take pride in that, professional pride in the scientific achievements, engineering achievements. Okay. But for that reason, we can have confidence. We needn't fear. We are a presence in the Arctic. People talk about, oh, the U.S. has to build a giant fleet of icebreakers. I say no. The U.S. Navy is in the Arctic. Believe me, you may not see them, but they're there. Okay, so we don't have to be scared. There's no great threat to the United States. Yes, we should. I am in favor of building up the icebreaker fleet, but in very kind of moderate ways. I support the new polar cutter, which we're building now, but it doesn't have to be radical. We don't need, giant fleet of icebreakers, something like that. But thanks for the question, Forrest, and for looking at my book.
I guess a final question, since we're almost out of time, on a slightly different front. I mean, as a SAIS graduate, as somebody working on sort of China-related topics as they relate to other countries like Russia, I wonder if you have any reflections on your own sort of professional trajectory, or any thoughts of people who may be interested in pursuing this area, whether in think tank research, academia, etc.
Well, boy, it is an interesting time for me to reflect on my career, because I just sort of changed it radically. I just want to say again that I really love SAIS. I mean, I must say, no offense to the other institutions that I studied at, but my SAIS experience was absolutely, and Adam and I know because we studied together at Princeton, but SAIS, I feel, built these like incredibly important pieces of my brain, it's the first time that I had studied languages before, and I didn't study Chinese at SAIS, but I wish I did, but I studied Russian at SAIS, and I remember just the concentrated focus on language as a tool, as part of your toolkit as a professional. And I can't emphasize enough how important that was, but the other pieces too. I mean, I did strategic studies at SAIS, and fondly remember that work I did there. And as an expert on military strategy, that really were the core pieces. But on a day-to-day basis, I use the economic training, even monetary theory, things that they make you do at SAIS, but that really are just critical to any international relations specialist. Now, I went, after I did my PhD, then I went into government service, and I'm very proud to have served in government service. I learned a tremendous amount. It was a great place to start a career. But I also, with time, I've seen that government service has so many restrictions, as far as travel. It got to a point, and I must say very sadly, where if I wanted to talk to a Chinese national, I would have to report that at the assistant secretary level in the Pentagon. And that level of restriction, frankly, it's a sign of a new Cold War, but I couldn't live with that anymore. I just said, in order to be a China expert, to comment thoughtfully on Chinese affairs, I need to talk to Chinese people. I need to go to China frequently. That's the only way, honestly, we can have good China expertise, right? You got to walk the walk. So that's another thing I would tell students there, and I know a lot of you in Nanjing are walking the walk better than anybody. So I really commend you and applaud what you're doing. But so there are advantages of government service. You can have a say in meetings that are very important. But also outside the government, you could speak more freely, travel more freely, and build your expertise more kind of expansively. So, I would definitely consider both, but see the merits of both approach. And so I'm that's why I moved to the think tank world. and you'll hopefully and do be in touch with me. But you'll see me tweeting. And by the way, I was never on Twitter until a couple of months ago when my current employer said, I said, I'm not interested in Twitter. You know, Trump does Twitter. I don't want to do that. And my employer said, no, you will do Twitter. So you'll see me tweeting every day. But I've realized that, for somebody of my generation, maybe Adam can sympathize. This is kind of new to us anyway, at some level. And so for me, I'm coming around to it. But anyway, you see a lot of me as a kind of vocal proponent of U.S.-China relations and engagement and against the new Cold War. I think that's a terrible idea, a terrible concept, and we need to fight it very vigorously. So anyway, thank you so much for having me today, and enjoyed the dialogue, and hope we can do a lot more talking. As you know now, I'm a big fan of SAIS and SAIS Nanjing, the Hopkins Center there.
Oh, so thank you very much for coming. It's a really interesting talk. Haley, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could share your email address, if that's like a good way, or
yeah.
you prefer
Oh,
like
yeah, maybe you can put it
LinkedIn
in the chat. That would be good.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see if I can manage that technological.
because sometimes it's hard to find people who have gone a government route and then they also have studied like environment, but they're also like, let's like not break down the contact with China at the same time type of issue.
No, you're right. I agree completely, Haley, with your point. And
okay, there it is.
I was feeling more and more isolated. By the way, my 2015 book does have an environmental chapter, though, so I'm definitely keen on the environment. I think it's critically important and often gets obscured by these geopolitical issues and defense issues and so forth. So, but yeah, be in touch, folks, and thanks for taking the time with me today.
Oh, thanks so much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you in Nanjing at some point in the future.
Count on it.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
再见。